Let me first introduce myself to you. I'm Sylvia Wisniewski. I'm one of the managing directors of Finance in Motion, an impact asset management boutique company based in Germany. And when UN Environment asked me to moderate this session, I thought I really have to go for that because the topic is really a topic of my heart. Because next to promoting micro and small enterprise financing, a large part of what we're doing is actually dedicated to greening the economy. So sustainable land use finance is obviously at the core of this subject. I think there's no need to preach to the convicted, but perhaps just to set the stage a little bit, I think many of you in the room are aware that emissions that are related to land use, largely agriculture, is actually the second biggest driver of global emissions. It's contributing 25% actually to the global toll, while at the same time it only receives 3% of the climate finance. So actually there's a huge divide between the problem making on the one side and on the other side the solutions, and many of the solutions actually require financing. So we hope that in this afternoon we can contribute to close this divide at least a little bit by showcasing interesting examples where people and institutions try to actually move more financing to convert land use to sustainable practices. Because we all know that the problem that already is quite gigantic today will most likely become even bigger if we're not doing anything right now. I mean, we know 800 million people go to bed every night being hungry. We know the expectation for world's population growth is going to reach 9 billion, most likely in 2050. So all that will increase pressure on agricultural production and by definition also on land use. So it's not just 5 minutes before 12, I think it's 1 minute before 12, and therefore it's great to see that there's such a large interest in seeing how we can basically push back the clock, meaning winning more time to solve the problem, and how we can mobilize more funding, particularly from the private sector, to help us solve the issue. So we want to have this very practical event. That's why I'm very pleased to see so many practitioners coming with very concrete and tangible examples. But we certainly also want to leverage your know-how, your experience, your lessons learned from so many projects and programs that you may accompany. So therefore, there will be the possibility to really actively participate. We will use Slido for that. So there are a couple of questions that we pose also to you to get your feedback on. And we will also certainly get you in with questions and comments, so that in that sense, we have a much, much broader panel than just the 5 people, 6 people that are here on stage. So with that, I would say let's go working. And it's great to see Eric here. So that's good news. But before we give the word to Eric to address you with his welcome speech, let's watch a very short video prepared by UN Environment, which in my view crystallizes very nicely the issues that are of concern to all of you here in the room. So let's watch the video.
Did you know that on average, 7 million hectares of tropical forests disappear every year? The equivalent of 26 football fields every minute. Most of it comes from agriculture, whether from efficient, large farming businesses or low-yield smallholder farmers. But in order to feed our rising population, farmers need to produce more, and their most cost-effective solution is for them to deforest new terrain. However, today, nearly 40% of our land surface is already dedicated to agriculture. If this goes on, we won't tackle the climate crisis or meet the Sustainable Development Goals. It is critical that we transition to deforestation-free agriculture. But there are obstacles. First, Farmers need technical knowledge to increase yields and at the same time preserve existing forests. Communities and businesses need incentives to restore degraded landscapes, and they need the capacity to implement integrated agroforestry systems where crops, cattle, and forest are mixed. Second, the transition also requires considerable funds, which farmers need to borrow from someone. But lenders and investors face costs and financial risks when financing the transition to sustainable farming. There is a need for governments, public and private finance institutions to scale up the availability of tools such as credit guarantees and junior or first loss loans. These are forms of insurance in case the borrower cannot reimburse his loan. The lender is covered for part of his losses, lowering the risk of such an investment. Grants are also needed to support smallholder farmers with training, development, and replanting, as well as monitoring the progress of businesses and communities to stop deforestation. By coordinating the appropriate government, financial, and corporate actors, UN Environment and partners can trigger a transformational shift in leveraging public funding to unlock and scale up private finance flowing to saving forests, restoring landscapes, and transitioning to climate-smart agriculture. Let's work together to make this global transformation happen.
Yeah, with that introduction, I would like to welcome Eric Solheim on stage to give your welcoming speech. As I heard this morning, you stand for the message, we can. We do not only destroy the planet, but we can also rescue it and save it. And I also learned that you're the man who can kill 3 birds with 1 shot. So I'm very much looking forward to tell us how you concretely do this in your environment and what kind of lessons learned you want to share with us as a shooter.
Thank you so much. And let me start with the man who invented this slogan, yes, we can, Barack Obama. I listened to him just before he left the office as the President of the United States in a meeting in Washington, and he said, my 2 young daughters, I think the names are Malia, Sasha, something like that, do not understand when I speak about acid rain. That was the main, he said, that was the main environment issue when I became an environmentalist and interested in the environment. And when I speak to my 2 daughters, they will just look like that, not interested at all. Why is that? Because the problem is resolved. There is no acid rain in the United States anymore, or at least hardly any. So no one is talking about it, and no one is interested in the problem. It doesn't exist anymore. And then comes what's interesting here. What was the recipe for getting rid of the problem? In my view, that's basically a universal recipe for change. You need 3 elements. Citizens, because if there is not a demand for change, putting pressure on politics and business, nothing will happen. You need brave politicians who regulate markets and take charge and set a vision. And you need the forces of business to be innovative, finding the practical solutions to how we can translate these changes into jobs and business opportunities. And when you look to basically whatever problem we have resolved in the past, all these 3 forces are there: citizens, private sector, and politicians. And look to the biggest change in the environment in the last 2-3 years. And it's happening at a speed no one thought possible. The price of solar and wind can now compete with the price of coal everywhere in the world. It cannot compete still with old-fashioned, already existing coal plants, but it can compete everywhere with new investments in coal plants. That's an enormous revolution because everyone knew that solar and wind is better for the health. Everyone knew it was better for the environment. No one did choose it because of the environmental health, but still most nations did make the choice of coal because it was so much cheaper, and people felt we cannot afford the expensive electricity, we need the cheap one. Now the prices come down to a level where it can compete everywhere in the world with coal. Well, then we will see a dramatic change of investment patterns, because when it's better for health, better for the environment, and better for the company and for the nation economically, of course it's very likely to happen. And again, this happened exactly for the same reasons. There was a demand for change in society. People wanted this to happen. There was a lot of government actions, feed-in tariffs in some nations, support for innovation in some other nations, support from science in other nations. A number of nations fortunately reduced the fossil fuel subsidies, which are still absolutely horrendous, but still they're very reduced in a number of nations. So there was government action to trigger the change. But at the end of the day, the change happened in business. Many of the original ideas may have come here from Germany or from the Silicon Valley, but it was the sheer size, mainly of the Chinese market, but also Indian and other markets, which brought down the price to such a level that it cannot compete everywhere in the world. So this combination of forces, business, politics, and citizens, and the size of the big markets are so enormous, and these forces can change the world. And of course, these are the forces we then, coming to the point here, we need to employ to make the changes we want to see when it comes to landscapes. We need citizens, we need non-governmental organizations, we need people who say, we do not want to destroy our landscapes any longer. We do want orangutans or gorillas to remain for future generations. We do not want to destroy the enormous beauty of the rainforest of Kalimantan or the Amazon. We need all those people who push change, the most needed. Should have more of it, and we should make it a broader political alliance. We also need political vision and leadership and regulations of markets, and we need business, because without that, we will not get the big money, and we will not get the innovative ideas, which I've been in politics my entire life. Politicians do not come up with innovative ideas which you need to transform the markets and behavior out there in society. So, for all these reasons, we have looked into how can UN Environment work more with the private sector. And let's admit it, historically, environmentalists have got it wrong. Historically, environmentalists mainly was very skeptical to business and the private sector, because they could always point to some business which got it wrong. I mean, that's easier. You can always still find businesses who made enormous crimes against humanity and environment. But as there are politicians who do badly, and sometimes even civil society groups who do badly, for sure there are business who do badly. Let's rather focus on all those businesses who want to transform the world, want to be part of the change, where the leaders want to change, and where they see a business opportunity to create jobs in the new sectors. We formed and signed in Paris last week during President Macron's climate meeting an agreement with BNP Paribas, the biggest or second biggest bank in Europe, and UN Environment. They will provide $10 billion, which is again big money, into small-scale farmers in Indonesia and India and beyond for transformation of their agriculture into being much more productive, so the family will be fed better, get more income, much more environment friendly, so that it will not destroy the climate, and of course it will reduce the subsidies which the governments of India is providing to fertilizer and different sorts of input, which we do want to reduce. So this is a win for the government, a win for the farmer, and a win for the environment at the same time. This cannot replace government policies. Let me end up with Indonesia as an example. Indonesia is one of my really favorite nations. Such a beautiful, fantastic land, blessed with good politicians over the last decades. It was all doomsayers 20 years back said that Indonesia will be the new Balkans, go down the drain in smoke and wars. To the contrary, established a very well-functioning system, good decisions, good leaders, corruption, yes, but still moving ahead. Indonesia has made all the right laws and decisions when it comes to protecting the rainforest and the peatlands. Not even the harshest, most critical environmentalists can really find anything wrong with the laws. Laws are passed by the parliament. There are laws, government want to implement them, Still, we know there is a lot of destruction of peatlands and rainforest, even when the laws are brilliant. Then, why does that happen? Well, it happens because there is corruption in the system. It also happens because it's not that easy for politicians to implement the laws, because there are limits to how much you can send police or the army to evict smallholder farmers from the land they have taken to feed their family. That will not portray yourself nicely on TV. You may even get protests from the same civil society groups which want to protect the forest. When you see the small-scale farmers being evicted, they don't like it. And for sure, you may not get votes in the next election if you do it. So it's not an easy proposition for the government of Indonesia simply to uphold the law. But of course, the one day you get investment system so that the farmers can get a much higher income from their land. The lowest productivity of smallholder farmers in Indonesia is 1/6 of the highest productivity. So if you can uplift those with 1/6 up to 6/6, or for that matter, if it's just 3 or 4/6, it will be a huge improvement. Then it's much easier for the government of Indonesia to uphold the law, because then you have an economic alternative, while at the same time use the police. So I say this because we cannot replace government action by business. We cannot replace the upholding of the law at the end of the day through police with investment opportunities, and you can supplement it. And then government and business will drag the society in the right direction, which will make the farmers of Indonesia more affluent and protect the remaining forest of Indonesia much better, and of course also give opportunities for production of peatlands and tree planting, whatever is needed. So to sum up, this is the idea. We now have some of the key leaders of this in the world. Satya Tripathi, my very good friend, who's the head of the Tropical Landscapes Investment Facility in Indonesia. That we have the and Green Fund. We have the European Investment Fund, or Investment Bank, and we have the Rabobank. 4 key players in this area who will discuss how we can really take this forward. But my message is we need all these 3: strong citizens movement, strong, brave political leadership, and the innovative and job-creating forces of business. If we focus on all these 3, we will be successful. Yes, we can.
Thank you so much for this very inspiring speech. Yes, we can. And you already announced the participants of the panel, so may I invite Jane Feehan, Satya Tripathi, Nano Kleiterp, and Ben Falk on stage. And we use the time until everyone is seated that you get prepared, because you need to work too. So I hope we get a slide on now to explain to you how Slido is gonna work. I hope we can get that. Excellent. So the first thing, obviously, get your mobile, and then please go to the Slido website and register with the hashtag. Immediately when you go to Slido, it will ask you for the hashtag, so there's nothing you, in that sense, can get wrong. So please put then the hashtag in, GLF Finance, all in one word. And then you will see that basically you have a possibility to ask questions and to participate in a poll. We will have later some poll opportunities where everyone can participate, but also if you have questions while we start the discussion and have the discussion here, please also feel free to put your questions into Slido, and I will see that I can pick them on in the conversation we're gonna have here on the panel. It seems you moved right out there, so I come close to you, Ben, though, if you don't mind. Okay. Excellent. So I welcome again Jane Feehan from the EIB. She has been working for years on environmental programs, conservation finance, forestry finance, etc. Then there is Satya Tripathi from the Tropical Landscape Financing Facility of Indonesia, already being mentioned, and also with Indonesia highlighted as a country which got the political framework quite right. Then we have Nano Kleiterp here former CEO of FMO, and now here in his capacity as a board member to the end of the Green Fund, and Ben Valk, who's the head of the food and agri partnerships at Rabobank. So welcome on stage.
Thank you.
Well, to kick off the discussion, I guess many here in the room are interested to learn from you where you see the challenges in mobilizing more funding to basically promote sustainable land use. What are the bottlenecks? What are the limitations? And what do you personally and your organizations actually do to showcase that, yes, it's possible, yes, we can do something, yes, we can. So, Jane, do you want to kick us off, sharing your experience from the ERB with the audience here?
With pleasure, Sylvia, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Jane Feehan. Thank you for the introduction. I have indeed been working in forestry and agriculture investments with the European Investment Bank for over 9 years, and I now work as a specialized loan officer focusing on natural capital investments, which covers some of the same areas, but is a bit broader than that. I'm very happy to be here today to speak to such a packed room, and thank you all for joining us for this session. I think maybe first of all to say that our title on scaling up climate finance, I'd actually like to address as the kind of the main challenge that I want to speak to really is not specifically on the climate finance part, but on bringing private investment in, whether it's climate or not, bringing private investment into sustainable land use. And that, I think, is the kind of overarching challenge that characterizes a lot of the work that I've been doing this year. So that's one challenge. Another challenge that has really come out, I think, really emerged from our work in the European Investment Bank in this area during the course of 2017 has really been that we can take nothing for granted in this area. We can't for a moment assume that the rationale for investing in the productive resource base of the planet, obvious though that may sound to us, it is not obvious to others. And that case, the rationale for doing that has to be built and made one investment at a time. And it might seem hard to comprehend why isn't more money flowing into this? I mean, the wins are multiple. The business case seems to be obvious, doesn't it? But in fact, that really needs to be constructed and justified one investment at a time. And a third challenge to frame my few remarks is really that there is a need, I think, in our work emerging again and again, the need to put the business case for investing front and center, and really that marketable goods and services should be really at the forefront when we are trying to call on the private sector to come in with greater volumes of investment. So those are maybe three challenges to frame the remarks. And Sylvia said to us beforehand, she said, you can outline some of your main challenges, but we have to talk about solutions to those challenges as well. And indeed we do. So on the subject of solutions, the main area of work that I'm working on at the moment is a facility that we have in the European Investment Bank called the Natural Capital Financing Facility, which is a small, I say small, and it's 120 million euros, which can go a long way, but in EIB terms, that is a small facility. So I'm working with colleagues who would be used to dealing with much bigger volumes for just a single project. But nevertheless, this is a valuable facility which brings important additional impacts in an area where we don't have many tools to operate. So this natural capital financing facility will support 10 to 12 projects within the European Union which deliver benefits to nature conservation and nature-based solutions to climate adaptation. And what I'd like to do is mention two examples of the projects from the pipeline of this facility, really as I think a microcosm of solutions which could be applicable more widely. And these are two projects which we're working on actively at the moment. We have already been signing and approving other deals, but these two are, I think, quite instructive for our discussion this afternoon. The first is a €6 million loan to a new partnership which aims to sustainably develop and use a large marine conservation area in the Mediterranean, coastal marine conservation area. Now, private sector project. So we ask, what's the business case? And where are the revenues coming from this? How are they going to pay back our loan? What's the business rationale for doing this? So the business case is that this beautiful spot is a magnet for tourists, including divers. It's also a productive, if degraded, fishery. And the stakeholders who enjoy this area currently all recognize that if the conservation value and the ecosystem health declines further, all of that will be lost. So there is an acknowledgement that there's a need to work together, but it's complicated and so on. But that's the main rationale. So how will the revenues be generated? Well, revenues will flow from the registration system, which will be put in place to register and then impose a levy on certain users of certain activities in the area. For example, diving and certain types of fishing. So all users will have to be registered, and certain users will have to pay a levy for using, enjoying, exploiting this sensitive zone. The educational potential would also be developed by offering training courses for a range of ages, and that can also generate revenues for certain parts of that offer. Crucially, a percentage of those revenues would be earmarked to go back into the conservation, because everybody involved recognizes that at the heart of all of this is the fact that this is a nature reserve with wonderful nature. It has to be protected, so money needs to go into that as well. So that's one example, which we hope to be able to support in the coming year. A second example is a €5 million investment in a fund which is developing a suite of conservation services in Northern Europe. What do I mean by this? So,
and Jane, you have a 20-second pitch, okay?
20-second
Convince
pitch,
me
Sylvia.
As an investor to give you the money, 20 seconds.
Okay, got it. So what's the business case and where are the revenues coming from? Well, the business case here is that there are many corporates in the country. I'm not going to mention the country because it's all secret. There are many corporates in this country who recognize that they need to invest more in their social license to operate. They need to be seen to be investing more in the conservation value of some of the areas that they own or that they're neighboring, and this needs to be done in a way which is credible and meaningful for conservation. And that's the business case, and the revenues obviously are from the fees.
Where's my return?
Corporates will pay.
And where's my return coming from? I mean, okay, so we have a bit of greenwashing to the corporates. Okay, fine.
So I'm this
part.
But yeah, well, I'm this fund which is developing this suite of services, and I recognise that there is some goodwill here. This is enlightened self-interest. Some of it may be coming from a corporate social responsibility motivation, but that can be harnessed to do good for conservation in this area. And that makes it eligible for our facility. So here are some solutions that we're trying to bring to the table, and I hope that's a microcosm of some of the kinds of ideas which can be scaled up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So now, from these very European-focused examples, let's jump to Asia. I mean, Indonesia was already mentioned as a country which has a lot to offer, so we're very curious to learn, Satya, your lessons learned in the fund to understand where you see the challenges in your country, but where you also see the solutions.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a privilege to come and share with you the work that UN Environment is doing in partnership with BNP Paribas, the World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF, and ADM Capital, which is our fund manager for the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility. Listening to Jane, I really she has my respect because we talked to the EIB in 2015 and 2016 and trying to impress upon the fact that they need to look at landscapes as something with huge investment potential. And of course, the answer was no, that it's too risky. We're not getting into that area at this time, in all respect. So I know where it was and how much effort she has put in. For some of you, it might look like, oh, okay, 5 million, 6 million, what are we talking here? But that's the beginning. That's where you start chipping away at a system that does not believe in investing in landscapes. That's the story, and that's the message to take away from for all of us. Indonesia, what is happening? We started last year. We don't get a penny from the government. The government is not investing in the facility, no sovereign guarantees, no resources from the government of Indonesia, but the government is very strongly involved. You cannot do this without the government because they own the policy space. They are the ultimate institution responsible for delivering public goods in the country. So if you do not work with them, it's a no-brainer that it's not going to go very far. Our model is a best practice because this is 100% supported by the government. We're a private finance facility that was launched on 26th October last year out of the coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs. Half of the cabinet was there. So the coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs, Padarmin, is actually the champion. The Vice President is the champion. The President is the champion. The President's office, the President's Chief of Staff, when we started the conversation, Pak Luhut Panjaitan, who's now the coordinating Minister for Maritime Affairs, was the champion that started this whole conversation in his office. So the government has to be strongly behind this. Without that, this does not work. And that's where UN Environment's strength lies as a neutral actor that brings the strength of the UN system into the conversation, ensures the buy-in of the government partners and major civil society stakeholders, and brings in other actors as equal partners in this process. So Indonesia, we launched 26th October last year. Our secretariat started on 13th of December. Some would say unlucky day. It's been very lucky for us. Eric opened the secretariat on the 13th of December because that's the only day he could get there. And in less than a year, we've produced an investment in a project of $331 million value. We'll be disbursing next month, the first tranche of $95 million. It brings back to life a degraded landscape of 90,000 hectares and protects a virgin rainforest of 300,000 hectares because this particular degraded land is a part of that landscape which has been degraded over decades. So
how did you make that work? I mean, it sounds like a gigantic project.
It
I
works.
suppose a lot of stakeholders involved.
Large number of stakeholders involved. There's a big civil society partner, as Jane rightly pointed out. There are things you can't declare in public till it's declared in public because of the non-disclosure agreements. That's why she couldn't tell you which country it was, but I can tell you where it is. But so it's a big global partner, a corporate, and we're working with an Indonesian partner together. They've set up a joint venture. So this will be a rubber plantation, sustainable rubber plantation of 90,000 hectares in 3 different landscapes. And that is, and so the loan is 15 years, and it's got a few first few years as moratorium, and then we have a capital guarantee from one of the development finance institutions, so that reduces the cost of capital. So it's a combination of a lot of actors, and in January we'll be very happy to, when we are doing the disbursement, and this will be announced in presence of the government of Indonesia sometime in January, so it will be public. But suffice it to say that it directly involves 18,000 farmers, provides livelihoods to 100,000 people, in most cases increasing their incomes by 300 to 400% over the next few years, saves a lot of endangered species, and I could go on and on. But that's Indonesia. We're working on 27 different projects of similar value, size, because scale matters. We're running out of time, so we want to, so that's one challenge, how we can scale. India, what we are doing is something very different. Forest is not so much of a challenge in India, although it always is, but we are focusing on sustainable agriculture. So the work we are doing there, and this is more or less public because the government is involved, so I can tell you, it's in the province of Andhra Pradesh, where the chief minister, who's a very, very dynamic individual, just to give you a little background, this gentleman was responsible for the software revolution in India in his last incarnation of the chief minister when he was there for more than 10 years as the chief minister of that province. Now he's put his focus on natural farming. He wants to convert his entire state of 54 million people to agriculture without chemical fertilizers, without pesticides, without insecticides. They've already rolled it out to 150,000 farms. They'll take it up to 200,000 farms by March next year. And the Sustainable India Finance Facility's first investment will be to the tune of $2.5 billion in this facility, in this particular project. And we're working with the chief minister and all his very able and competent colleagues that are completely determined to transform agriculture through natural farming in the next 5 to 6 years. And imagine what it does. You're talking about 8 million hectares of land, but they're all connected. It's just the agricultural land is 8 million hectares. So in terms of the reversal of biodiversity losses, the reclaiming of planetary boundaries, the regeneration of ecosystems, and imagine this province is the second largest coastline in the country, what it does to the coastal waters. And one could just imagine at the possibilities that it would, and why we are doing it. Of course, we have a great champion in the chief minister who really wants to take it to the next level. But more importantly, this presents phenomenal at scale or at a system level a design for other provinces in the country to emulate, and even other countries in different. There's so much interest in other parts of the world, and we think we are privileged to be a part of this whole process, led by Eric Solheim, who met with the chief minister, and then it has fallen upon me to follow up on his assurances to the chief minister, and we're working together to make it happen. Now, in terms of solutions, I'll just take a minute on solutions. And I think the biggest challenge lies in not finding the money. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of private capital that is waiting to be deployed. The biggest challenge is finding the deal makers, people that really believe in the possibility of that you can create these investments, and understanding the risks, breaking them down to manageable parts, finding the partners that will take on those distinct risk modules and then make them manageable. That's what makes it work. That's what we learned in Indonesia. That's what we are learning as we go along with our work with the first project in India, and there are many other projects we are looking at. But the bottom line is that we're thinking of ourselves to run a boot camp, actually, for those that are involved, for deal makers, to bring in young people that still believe in the possibility of the impossible, and then train them so that they can go out and look at opportunities and bring these ideas together, so that, because private capital is unlimited, unlike donor funds. And so money is available. It's just finding the right model so that the money can be deployed. Thank you.
Thank you, Satya, for adding further to the challenges, but also presenting these gigantic projects. I must say that I've never heard about projects of that size. So I'm sure many people here in the room are curious to learn how to do it.
Solheim for that, not me. He doesn't think
he
small.
He said yes, he can.
He doesn't think small, so
can.
blame him for that.
Okay. But now that we heard, let's say, the first speakers on the challenges that they see, we're certainly also curious to learn what you see as challenges and where you feel things are difficult from your perspective. So therefore, we would like to pose the first question, and then we certainly go on with Nano and Ben, but we would certainly also like to understand what your view is on the challenges. Is it an issue of the concept is too vague, not so clear? Is it an issue of there's basically a lack of projects? We don't exactly know, where to invest in. Is it more the riskiness that these projects basically are not so clear from a business case perspective, from a risk profile perspective, or is it that there's a lack of respective risk capital to actually underline those transactions. And I would give you still a couple more minutes to vote on that, and then let's see whether some of the further contributions here on stage by Nano and Ben confirm one or the other of those answers. Or maybe you have completely different challenges that you have to deal with. Nano, your life is probably much easier now that you're no longer CEO of FMO. So I guess you're now only picking up challenges that you can actively manage and can show that, yes, you can, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, well, it's let's say it's easier on one side, but much more complicated on the other, because after leaving FMO, I decided to be very active in land restoration and landscape finance. And well, that's a part that FMO is becoming a little bit active now, but it is the most difficult part, I think, in the portfolio of FMO to make it moving. And that's also what we see. We are talking here about first funds. There's not a track record of many years. And the question for this afternoon is how to scale up. I would leave out, I agree with the climate, so how to scale up finance for sustainable land use. And I think it's very important that we have entrepreneurs. That we have entrepreneurs that are doing this. So I would like to ask, who is an entrepreneur in this audience who is really involved in making, in operating in landscapes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ben is also saying he's doing it, but I have a next question for him. So really having operations, producing things in landscapes. Who's doing that? 2, 3, 4. Okay. Who is investing money, risk money, and expects a commercial return from landscapes? Well, return. But okay, so that's 5 to 10, and we are about more than 200 people here in Stripe. So it's
60, 100.
we're talking about 5% of the people who are really we need to make this work, because we need the entrepreneurs and we need the financiers. So that is crucial to scale up sustainable land use, and we need to start small. That's all agreed. But so I think somebody this morning said, when I'm not at the table, probably at the menu. Well, I think that's what's happening with the financiers and with the entrepreneurs. So we need to get them in here, because these conferences are focused on the governments, on the NGOs, on the development finance institutions, but not enough to get them here, because we need to convince them and connect with them and speak their language instead of they learning to speak our language, because that's not going to work. So that's the first absolute challenge, because I think all these conferences have the same problem. The people who really have to make it work in the private sector, and that's the only way that we can scale it up, are the entrepreneurs, because we need investable projects, and the only one who make investable projects are entrepreneurs. And we need to scale up, and the only one who have big and deep pockets are institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies. Those are the ones in the commercial sector that can do it. And we need to understand them, because as was explained already, we need to de-risk what they're doing, because in their normal business model, it doesn't work. No, because let's say all of us probably have a pension, and how many of us would like to get our pension funds the message, oh, I'm sorry, your pension was reduced to 50% this year because we made these fantastic investments in landscape and it didn't work out as we expected. So we don't want them to take a responsible risk. We want them to take responsible risk, and this is a new area, so we need risk mitigation. And that's why it is fantastic that we have now this fantastic discussion on blending finance. So governments are seeing, I think that was in Addis Ababa, I've been for 40 years in development finance. It was the first time at scale that I saw governments saying private sector is important and private sector can help us solve it. Because as Eric said, before let's say 10 years ago, the private sector were the bad guys in the movie, and they couldn't do anything good in development. It were the governments that should do it, and it were the civil society organizations. So now we have a big recognition, and also the recognition that governments say it's not enough what we have, so we have to use our scarce money to crowd in the private sector. So I think that is the big challenge.
And how do you do that? How do you crowd in?
I tell you, I have a fantastic example. And that is the fund we just created, and Green.
I thought so.
You thought so, no? That's all. You gave the opening for me. So the Ant Green is a new project. So what we need is innovative and new ideas, because this is not an easy space, and I think we have heard about innovative and new ideas, and Ant Green is one of them, and we need many of them. The basic thing of Ant Green, I think the innovative part, so it is a debt fund, a subordinated debt fund. So we're going to provide debt and long-term money. So what already was mentioned, long-term money is scarce. Even the development banks are not providing long-term money, but up to 7-10 years. But between 10 and 20, and we're talking here about forest, we're talking about landscape, we need long-term money. And that's between 10 and 20 years, and maybe longer will be better. So the Ant Green Fund is an evergreen fund. We would like to keep the money in there and have it for a very long, so we can provide very long-term finance. The second part, what was mentioned, which is also a challenge, is the public-private partnership. So the Ant Green Fund can only invest in jurisdictions which comply with basic criteria, that is regions which have a plan and which have set targets to stop deforestation. And the targets can be monitored and can be followed, so it has to be transparent, it has to be a transparent declaration where they head up, when do they want to get there, and what are the steps to get there. And then the fund can invest. So that's a big advantage for these regions, because once governments, local governments, regional governments decided on this, they know there's a fund which will invest in their region. Then for businesses, it's also important, because the Green Fund only invests in areas where there's production related to tropical forests. So then we're talking about, let's say, of course, Indonesia, about Brazil, about countries in Africa where there's a lot of tropical forests, Latin America. And we're talking about the most difficult crops there, related to social and environmental issue, which we're talking about livestock, we're talking about palm oil, we're talking about pulp and paper, rubber. So all those things where many of the development banks are saying, well, this is really a very high reputational risk. Let's not do too many of these projects. I know, I was there, and there are good reasons to do it. So you have to find a new way to do it and reduce reputational risk. And one of the things to reduce it is to do it in a jurisdiction where the framework is there, where the targets are there, and where a company that's investing in this jurisdiction, in this region, can say, I'm supporting the government's plan. Because then things go together and it gets a strong force and a strong voice. So that's, I think, the innovation is basically that, and that the fund on financing requires companies to have a landscape protection plan themselves. So the target of the fund is that we want to raise 400 million. We raised already more than 100 million US dollars. We think that by the end of next year we can have 400 million. So invest 400 million in the next 4 to 5 years. The fund can only do a maximum of 25% of a project, so it takes the highest risk. So we have to crowd in other investees and other lenders to the project. So in total, 1.6 billion will be moved, let's say, and will be catalyzed to invest in, let's say, forest-free, deforestation-free commodity producing. So that's basically, I think, the challenge, but there's also, let's say, the innovation. And what it makes work is that we need companies, and I think that's why we need them next year, many in this building. We need companies that have the conviction that that's the way to go forward. We need the front movers that show that commodity production without deforestation and inclusion of smallholders can be done and can be managed. And that's what the fund wants to show, and wants to show that it can be commercially done, and that the second Ant Green Fund will be funded not only by governments, but will be mainly funded by private investors, and that we can do it.
Okay, but let's not jump too quickly to Ant Green Fund 2. let's first make Green Fund 1 work.
You need a dot on the horizon.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking you, what do you have in the pipeline? What are, let's say, the tangible projects you're currently working on? Because, I mean, you started officially, I mean, you incorporated about a half a year ago, roughly.
Yeah, so we have now the whole team, we have the whole governance, so we have been working on the pipeline.
Can you give us a little bit of, quick sneak peek?
Can give you a quick, yes,
just
I can.
Allow us to look a little bit behind the curtain.
Of course,
you're working on?
in Indonesia, it's related to palm oil. It's a similar project, I think, maybe a little bit smaller scale. A supply chain company involving smallholders, stopping deforestation, having an agreement that, let's say, they conserve on concession about 20,000 hectares forest, and that they also, which is a possibility within the agreement with the fund, also off concession they conserve. So actively see that forest is being protected, and of course with all the new means we have as global forest laws, it can be actively and daily followed and monitored. In Brazil, with a soy company, intensifying the soy production, so there's less pressure on deforestation. And let's say also what Eric said, I think about Indonesia and Brazil, also legalization is is already progressed a lot. But we are asking the companies to do more. No? So in the legal framework for forestry, they have to conserve 80% of forest. We are asking them to do more, and we are asking them to include smallholders. So do a step forward and bringing also, let's say, benefits to the smaller producers and stopping the smallest producers from deforestation.
Okay. Well, before we go on now with Rabobank and Ben sharing his experience and his story, let's perhaps take a look at the poll results. So Ben, look very carefully.
Yep.
So the message here is that half of the room believes the projects are too risky, the business case isn't proven. So that would mean, is Rabobank out of business?
Are we out of business?
So
No,
please
we're
prove
doing
to
fine,
these
thank you.
48% that there is business out there.
Yeah. First of all, the question whether the business case isn't proven or projects are too risky, that's basically kind of communicating channels, I would say. Risk is just something you price, and that then decides whether the business case works, yes or no. Mm-hmm. Now, in many cases, the business case does not work. And that's a very simple thing about money, investment money, bank loans. Whoever has some money to use and apply somewhere, it flows like water to the lowest point. And the lowest point is where reasonable returns are made with acceptable risk. You have higher risk, all fine, then your returns need to be better. So that's the very key and simple thing. And many initiatives are good initiatives, but they don't really even take into account the full business case. In all the publications about this summit and about this particular session and about interventions, I hear so much about production. I hear hardly anything about markets. And markets is where your product gets sold, where your cash is generated, where your cash flow comes from. If you don't have that, in enough reliability, enough volume, with enough liquidity, then there is no business case. So first of all, please start including markets. Start asking where your palm oil is getting used, consumed, processed. And that's one of the real deficiencies we're facing. 20% of global palm oil production is Roundtable certified. After more than 10 years of working on this certification. So first question, is the model of certification, voluntary kind of certification of palm oil, is that the best model? Or should it be enforced? Is a real question. But none of that, whether it's certified or not, none of that is really visible on the consumer side. Consumers have no idea. And all of us have used today so many products incorporating palm oil. So we need to do something there. There's another issue, of course, on pricing. There's a whole lot of issues on that is the linkage between resource utilization and pricing of food products or agricultural products is so weak that it will be extremely hard to really come to large scale sustainable food production if we don't get better at including real cost. So there are a couple of real market issues that need to be fixed. Now, there was an interesting comparison by Eric, the comparison between the food system and the power system. And true, we are further advanced with getting our electricity system, well, more sustainable. We've made more progress with wind, solar energy, etc. Although the Netherlands still has their very recently developed coal power plants, coal-driven power plants, and even worse, we ship so much coal from Rotterdam Harbor to Germany. Why is there still such a huge demand in Germany? So that's not a total solution, but the solutions are clearer in the power sector. Now, why is that more advanced? And one of the reasons is I was just looking at the numbers of access to electricity. Netherlands, Germany, 100%. Very interesting figures. Let me just look at countries starting with an N, so I at least include the Netherlands.
Countries with an N.
Yeah, Netherlands,
Norway.
100. Nicaragua,
Thank you.
80% access to electricity. Nigeria, 58%. Niger, 14%. Now, people having access to electricity are the more well-to-do people in all these countries. So lots of you are asking for green power, and you can afford to ask that question. The issue with smallholder farmer food production is these are not the well-to-do people. And they cannot really afford to ask the sustainability question. That's the issue. We first need to work, or at least concurrently, we need to work on their economic development, their food security, their personal access to electricity and health, and to sustainable food production and landscape management and development towards sustainable landscapes. And you cannot afford to leave out the economic development angle, because that is what will drive the smallholder farmers' decisions. So as Rabobank, we have this initiative with 7 other global partners, World Food Programme, a couple of the main input suppliers, farm input suppliers, called Farm to Market Alliance. We have over 100,000 smallholder farmers in it. We do 4 things. We provide them, first of all, that access to markets. So the demand side that I just mentioned. Access to high-quality farm inputs, access to finance, access to technology. That's it. It's a model that others do as well, so this is not exclusive. The key thing we do is not finance, it's not inputs, it's not technology, it's access to markets. That's the key thing. And when you do that, you can very easily, in the life of a smallholder farmer, make a real difference by raising their annual income by hundreds of dollars, even on 1, 2, 3 acres. So here's the point. If you do that, then there's the access point for sustainable food production, for reducing GHG emissions, for better soil care, for carbon effective crop choice, crop diversification. But you have to do this combined with the economic angle. And the economic angle you only serve well when you take into account the full value chain. Well, that's basically my message. Done.
Thanks, Ben. And it seems you have a very clear business model and a very clear understanding of what is required in addition to finance, which I find quite interesting that we're talking about finance here all the time, but I think you made a very important point that actually the other elements are probably even more important.
May I add one other angle to this?
Yes, please.
It's super interesting. Of course, all of us, and especially the renowned institutions like the European Investment Bank, but also Rabobank, FMO, of course, have these sustainability policies or ENS standards, or whatever you call it. Most of them have been very defensive. We do not do child labor. We don't invest in tobacco. We won't trade weapons, etc. That defensive side of our ENS is basically totally looking at ourselves. It's just to protect ourselves from problems, from nasty articles in papers or whatever.
So I see the ENB raising her hand, but let's first listen to Ben.
We need to turn over our ENS policies to an offensive approach. So what is it that you are aiming to realize? Not what are you trying to avoid? And my challenge to many of you would be, try to get out of the defensive side. It's not really interesting. Someone else will do it. Try to get on the offensive side. That's the deal maker side. That's the entrepreneurial side. You can do the same in sustainable landscapes.
So I think that triggered immediately Jane.
It did. It's true, because I believe that that's the case. I do partly agree with that. That strong safeguards will only get you so far. I was actually mindful that we hadn't mentioned safeguards up to that point, and it is important to put that on the table. But I do believe that our strong safeguards, which in terms of forest protection are very strong actually. I mean, we don't lend even to concessions in natural or semi-natural forest, even if they are certified. We do not lend to exploitation of natural forests at all. We would rather promote sustainably planned and managed plantations. But the thing is, we recognize that when we impose our safeguards, as we usually lend 50% of the project costs, we are raising the bar for the whole project. Then other financiers will come in, but that project is stronger because we have insisted on those standards. So I think it means that we are raising the bar for the quality of the projects that we support. I do agree with what you said, though, that we need to go further than that. And it's with that in mind that this facility I mentioned earlier on, what we're trying to do is say, it's not just about, the things we shouldn't do. We have to turn that around and say, well, there is a business case for investing in this. What does that business case look like? Who is doing that? What are their investment needs? And what financing tools do we need to meet those requirements? So I agree, we need to take it one step further, but let's build on those safeguards rather than allowing them to be eroded.
Mm-hmm. Well, and with that, I would like to bring in the voice of you here in the room, because you posted a lot of questions, and let me try to bring this now into the discussion here. I mean, I think the last intervention here from Ben actually made the point on smallholders and how to basically serve them better and how to create, let's say, an incentive environment that allows them to basically then also look at sustainability questions. But first you need to get the basics in place before you can actually do that. Actually, many ask this kind of question of, how can we bring the smallholders and the SMEs, more into the picture? And here is the explicit question. And, you have a very commercial approach and make it work. You say we help accessing markets, we help, getting the inputs right, the technology right, etc. Here, the question that the audience asks is more coming from a different angle, and that is, can by combining or connecting public and private capital, smallholders be better served? And how should we do this in the best way possible? How should public and private capital actually work together to help smallholders and SMEs to actually change their production methods to more sustainable practices? Anyone who wants to comment on that? Santi first.
Yeah. I think there's a very serious business case for combining public and private finance in trying to mitigate the risks. As I mentioned, we have a 50% capital guarantee for the first project we're doing, so there's some public finance involved there. Of course, we're paying a fee and all, but then still public finance is involved. They're taking some of the risk. But just coming to creating these opportunities, I think with the first investment itself, in terms of the money we have invested in creating the facility and the opportunity on behalf of, so the primary funding has come from UN Environment and in part from ICRAF, so together. It's about 400 times leverage in terms of the money we have invested and the first investment that has been produced. That's just the first. And we are hoping we'll get to $500 million by June next year. So the leverage would only increase, not reduce. So there is a huge business case. And if anybody wants to discuss on the side after the thing, I'm very happy to give you all the details why I say so, that it's a 400 times leverage. And drawing on what Ben mentioned about the smallholders, I think it's a fascinating opportunity, and the two things he mentioned are very important takeaways. So I think our marriage with Rabobank is a match made in heaven. So I'm going to talk to Ben after this. Because in the Indonesia project, we have an offtake agreement of 75%, guaranteed offtake. It's built into the whole thing. Without that, it is impossible to structure an investment. So he's very right. We need to find that. In the first India investment that we are working on, the $2.5 billion, it's 6 million smallholders. So the costs reduced in terms of agriculture by up to 90% in most cases. Because there's zero chemical fertilizer, zero insecticides, zero pesticides, only natural substances. It's just the seed and some labor, and sometimes the cost of labor might increase because you're not using chemical fertilizers, but it's mostly subsistence agriculture, 2 acres, 3 acres, in some cases 10 acres, tenant farmers. So they put in their own labor actually. So, and as you go along, the soil organic carbon improves, the resilience of the land improves, so the cost of labor, even if you factor that as a cost, even if it is personal labor, it reduces over a period of time. But drawing on Ben's point, that it actually increases. The moment you drop, like we often say, energy saved is energy produced. It's the same thing in agriculture, drawing upon that analogy, that if your cost drops by 90%, your profits go up in that measure. So for a smallholder, that is phenomenal in terms of resilience, in terms of healthcare, education for the family, so the entire society improves. So we all need to take out our defensive lenses and really look at opportunities in terms of opportunities of not just in terms of commercial returns, what it does to us, our bottom line, but what it does to the society we inhabit in. And I think that's a very important thing to consider, all of us that have an opportunity to make an investment or review an investment. I think it's very important to look at that from the human aspect. Are we helping the society get better? I think that's the answer. Thank you.
Yes, two things. On the first thing, I agree completely with Ben on the ENS approach and the safeguards approach, that you have to combine the safeguards approach and make it a commercial approach. And I think you see that in the institutions who have their ENS people in the commercial departments, because that's what the big difference is. No? In FMO, they changed it. I tend to say we, but that's not true. So they changed it about 10 years ago and moved the people who were looking at risk, sit them together with the commercial people and looking at companies, where are the opportunities? Because then it is a change of mindset. On the smallholders, of course, what we see in green, where you're talking about commodities, then in general, the market is less of a problem when you're talking about exporting and commodities. But there the problem is finance, and how to finance the intensification of production. So how to improve productivity, because that's the only way that we reduce deforestation, and it has to be, let's say, an objective of the company, of the off-taker. And the positive, let's say, development, what we see is that off-takers are more and more interested in where the product comes from, because they have to trace the product, they have to see that it really, that there is really no deforestation, that it is produced, if we're talking about organic or biologically, that it is produced in such a way. So companies are gathering a lot of information on the smallholders, and it helps because all those information can also be used for to provide credit, because you know something about the credit worthiness of those smallholders. So that's the commercial incentives where it works. Still, the problem is, how can a company cope with the risk of providing a credit to those smallholders? And that's where blended finance come in, because I think that's also a learning process. So it will not be forever, but you need to have this risk-taking capacity, and governments can provide guarantees or can provide, let's say, risk-taking money. And also sometimes it's about the local interest rates that are very high. That can be combined, and then you can have the ideal recipe to get finance directly to the smallholders, provide them with access to markets.
So that's, however, a slightly different story than what I heard from Ben, where you said, well, it's all about creating the markets, and we as a bank feel responsible for that in a way, and see that this still works out for us also from a profit perspective. You know, facilitating access to markets, facilitating access to inputs, et cetera, et cetera. So being done without any, let's say, additional risk capital, being done without any kind of subsidy.
Talking about other, he's not talking about commodities, what I was talking about. Though there's the access to the market is there. So that's another part, which is very important, but even more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But how do you see these, let's say, competing models?
First of all, we need to be aware that I mean, public financiers will never realize their goal without private sector, and vice versa. It's very simple. Public financiers basically do not have direct market outreach to smallholder farmers or to groups of smallholder farmers or to SMEs in developing countries. It's simply not there. If you read World Bank report, IFC report, African Development Report, doesn't care whom, you know, and they say we've given so many farmers access to finance, it's best through a couple of other steps involving private sector financial institutions, local banks, microfinance institutions, even telco operators. Those are the people with the direct touch with farmers, farmer organizations, SMEs in emerging markets. So public money, which is super important because it's long-term, because it has a different risk profile, needs private sector. Private sector, on the other hand, certainly needs public sector risk-off, linked to government policies, and long-term kind of more patient capital. So there's kind of a forced marriage, but it has to be there. Mm-hmm. Has to be there. So we are dependent on public sector money, public sector is dependent on us. We, as an international private sector bank, are dependent on local banks with their networks. So we work through local banks, we enable them, we speak to them, we convince them, we help them with risk management. We do anything we can to make them lend to farmer groups. There's a super interesting question in this wonderful tool called Slido. Never heard of it.
You want to pick up that question from domestic FI?
Well, no, it's interesting. Why focusing on smallholder farmers? Yeah. What about the big producers of palm oil and soy? Now, it's a bit crop dependent, but it's because you can make your biggest gains when addressing smallholder farmers. Your biggest gains in sustainability, your biggest gains in impact on the livelihoods, on the landscape, on sustainable resource utilization, and on food security and farmer income. So that's why we are motivated to work not only, and of course we have all these big companies in our client portfolio and they make our profit, so we need them and they need us, but we are very motivated to work with smaller farmers because that's where you get your biggest gains. Now in soy, it's a bit different.
Ben, I think the biggest gain is when you do it through the big companies reaching out to the
Sure,
small farmers, because
sure.
then you have the outreach. So if you do it directly only to smallholders,
No.
That's impossible.
I
So
agree.
you need
Yep.
those companies to get there.
Yeah, yeah. In soy, it's a bit different. In soy, it makes a lot of, there's a lot of good reason to also work with the large producers, because those practices are still very, very questionable, of course. But by and large, I would say that is at least my and our motivation to work with smallholder farmers.
Good. Now coming to this other part, that is the big companies, the big off-takers, because there are a couple of participants here or in the audience asked the question, how do you actually control that they live up to the promises made? How do you make sure that they operate on a sustainable basis? And how can you be sure that what they promise is actually delivered? Satya.
Yeah, the model we follow is that we marry a CSO with a corporate. So the corporate is the aggregator. You need an aggregator. Ben is right. Mm-hmm. You can't achieve 90,000 hectares scale working with smallholders. You can, but it'll take you years and years to get them organized, and so then you lost your focus of achieving scale. So you need to find that corporate that is willing to sign up. So it's a lot of entrepreneurship there. But what we do is it's a model where we marry a CSO working with a corporate, and the CSO has absolutely impeccable credentials. I can't mention the CSO, but it's one of the large international CSOs that's working on this project. So they're responsible for conservation, sustainability standards being followed, capacity building of the farmers, working with them directly, making them understand their rights and obligations. So that's the way it is. We are developing another similar size project in another province where ICRAF is the civil society partner equivalent, and so they've done a huge green growth plan for that province. They understand that province very well, and so they're going to play that particular part, insisting on all the standards being followed. So we are not relying on the goodwill of the corporate for the standards to be followed. So and the
who
CSO
pays that CSO?
from a grant fund.
Okay.
The corporate doesn't pay the CSO, so there is no answerability to the corporate. They work together, but one gets money from a grant fund, the other gets a loan that they have to return. Mm-hmm. So that's how we ensure, and of course we have our ESG standards approved by our board, and which is very comprehensive. But the bottom line is that you need to find, and I hope we are right, we are experimenting, that these challenging parts are best dealt with by a CSO that has its heart in conservation, in helping the farmers, grassroots improvement in terms of livelihoods, health, education, and everything, and a holistic model. So that's what we do, and in all the projects we do that. And we work with global majors like TNC, WWF, Conservation International. So we're working with all of them, trying to develop different projects in partnership with them.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else who wants to comment on that question?
And thank you to the poser of that question. It's a very important point, of course. I mean, for us in the European Investment Bank, we're lending, it's around 4 billion euros a year to agriculture, agri-food and forestry projects throughout the value chain around the world. And these are projects which have in some cases, quite a large land take. So it's an extremely important question. How can we check if those projects are being implemented as they should be? How can we monitor that? And actually, in some cases, if we realize at an early stage that we can't monitor this, then we will pull out, because it is so important to be able to do that. Where we're working with some of the larger corporates, we will discuss at an early stage the monitoring program that needs to be put in place, whereby we can check the achievement of certain milestones. But for certain smaller or more early stage projects, we have technical assistance facilities to bring to bear on developing the right kind of monitoring system. And also, thankfully, we are living in a golden age or maybe the beginning of a golden age of high resolution, good quality, almost real-time data availability to be able to check what's happening ourselves and not to rely on someone else's data. Although it has to be said, we're doing some work now on blue economy investments and deep sea investments. And there, actually, this is one of the things we've been dwelling on, that we do not have the data in the oceans. But we're not talking about the oceans here now today, but just something to be thankful for on land. That, and we, the banks, need to be making more use of those resources, and we do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, to add another question, I'm picking up actually what Satya placed as a topic early on the discussion, and that is about landscape financing. I mean, not just looking at single projects, but really at a landscape. So there's the question from the audience. How do you, under such more complex, let's say, land use systems, how do you sort of get a business case out of that when, for example, forest, plantation obviously has a much longer payback period. On the other side, you have investors that may want to probably have a payout much earlier. So how do you make these, let's say, more comprehensive landscape investments actually into a business case where everyone gets a fair share? Anyone has an answer? No.
Well, I don't know if I have the answer. Exactly.
Yeah.
There are a lot of answers. Yeah. But first of all, and that goes back to my first question, who's an entrepreneur here and who's a financier here, is, let's say, companies don't finance landscapes. Companies are operating in landscapes, in a certain part of the landscape. What is very important, it's, like our friends and others, require them to have a landscape plan. So what's their impact on the landscape? How do they manage that impact? How do they cope with the negative effects that it could have? How does it relate? So making a landscape protection plan, you have to deal with multiple stakeholders. So there's technical assistance is needed because a lot of companies don't have that experience of doing it. But approaching it from a landscape and asking companies, could you please invest in the landscape and make a landscape investment? They will look very puzzled and say, what do you mean? I have my business, I do my business. How to integrate it in a responsible way in sustainable landscape? I think that's the question. And then you're talking about forestry, about agriculture, about tourism, etc. So that has to be brought together in one landscape. And the entrepreneurs and the financiers have to look at how do they protect the landscape they are affecting.
Mm-hmm. Rabobank, I mean, do you have a landscape approach in a way? Would you undertake landscape investments?
I very much concur with Nano, first of all. I think, we finance projects, we finance clients, we finance our clients' business. And increasingly there's an awareness, I think, of the role, basically multidimensional of a certain business or an economic activity or a non-economic activity in a landscape. And we are much more aware, I think, of the various dimensions of evaluating the impact of economic activity, including food production or agriculture, in a landscape than we've been before. If you would think about financing a landscape as such, including, let's say, the non-economic parts of it, or the biodiversity, or the measures needed to maintain or increase that biodiversity, for instance, then you would, really for sure, come down to also a significant portion of public sector financing. Mm-hmm. With long tenors. There are some very interesting questions here about these long tenors and why private sector parties do not offer it. Well, in many cases, because the business case is not there, because the macroeconomic environment is so unpredictable or unstable that you simply cannot price for that instability or risk of instability, political risk, on a very long-term basis. So again, that's just economic theory. And so yeah, it's a bit abstract, and as an abstraction, we can certainly work with the idea of investing in landscapes, but eventually it has to come down to certain specific activities that we finance or that public sector entities will finance.
Yeah.
Time,
Give a short one.
time is almost up, so I would like to pose the last question. From the audience, and Nana, you did this very quick sounding of who is who in the room. So I think we took away that there are very few investors in here, very few entrepreneurs. So I would guess the majority here comes from research institutions, NGOs, support initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. So the question here that was posed is, what do you recommend to us? Because many of the research institutes, many of the NGOs actually work on projects that look for financing. So what would you recommend to them? What is needed from the research institutions and from the NGOs so that we can find better equipped entrepreneurs, more market-based investment opportunities? So what's your message to the audience on that question? How can they support you? Don't look at me now, look at them.
Oh, look at me.
Okay, we'll start and then we
Yeah.
finish. Okay. I
And
think
very concise. So
yeah, no, absolutely.
everyone 1 minute.
What we need is a better partnership between the research institutions and entrepreneurs, because there's a lot of information and wisdom and knowledge there with the research institutions that somehow the linkages are just not there with the entrepreneurs, somebody that has a great idea. So, for you to be a little entrepreneurial in reaching out to people that have ideas and work with them, and that will present or produce large number of investable ideas that can then, of course, further be improved to put money on.
Sounds easy, right? Jane.
Oh, well, I would welcome colleagues who want to bring to our attention projects that we might be able to invest in. The European Investment Bank invests in projects. Even if they're not at a fully bankable stage, we can work with you. We can work with you to build, to carry out a market study, to develop the financial model. But you can help us to identify bankable, sound projects which can help to deliver under this agenda.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of advice needed for governments and regional governments and at that level to formulate plans and policies to involve scientific research and proof of what works best. And also for the companies, as was mentioned as a good example, to be able to follow their social impact, their environmental impact, and gather stakeholders and a multi-stakeholder dialogue. A lot of assistance and support is needed there. So there's a lot of CSOs that are working in that area. Focus also on companies to help them.
Rabobank, Ben.
Yeah, first of all,
Anything you want?
I read in a few of the questions that some people here are very motivated to start at boot camp for deal makers. So that's the first thing. I guess you can find each other just by jumping up and down.
And you serve as a mentor, I suppose, and right?
No. I would just go in full blown. The second thing is, one of the things that sometimes bothers me in these discussions is still very much European. And I think one of our biggest ways to really achieve success is to make this into a real global thing. And so whoever has this opportunity, like Satya is doing, which is really super great work, to bring these ideas and test them and work with them and make a lot of mistakes and failures in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, and even to some extent in North America, that would be really, really helpful. So please, let's turn this into a global thing. That's really my last point. Thank you.
Well, I think this is a very good ending because it also is an outlook and, as I understand, a boot camp to follow. So probably then next year when we come back to the Global Landscape Forum, perhaps this is really what we should do, go down to the practical stuff and how to make it really work. And, talk to the people who have already made it work, talk to those that try to make it work. So probably next year we will have an even more interactive exchange in a boot camp. And I see 4 trainers already, right?
If I can add, Sylvia,
lining up.
The first boot camp we'll be organizing in March in Jakarta. So we'll be sending out the information.
Okay.
So any of you that is interested is welcome to join. It's free.
So anyone who wants to grab this opportunity, please, after this panel, go to SETI and register and sign up. But now let's join for a big applause here to the audience and the panel. Sorry for not having had more time to address all of your questions, but I hope that you find some interesting pieces for yourself. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and hopefully to see each other then again next year. Thanks.
Oh, you're doing
absolutely
amazing.
Thank you. Great job.
Oof, yeah. No, but I mean, there were so many things that you could have dwelled in, in more detail, but it was difficult in that sense, to pull in, everything. But